Salam Media with me, Salalo Makwidiri. Today, we focus on two major geopolitical developments shaping Africa's security and diplomacy. The rising tensions between South Africa and Rwanda over the conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the shifting U.S. approach to Africa following its decision to cut key funding to the continent. On one side, Rwandan President Paul Kagame has issued a stark warning suggesting that Rwanda is ready for confrontation with South Africa. This follows President Cyril Ramaphosa's allegations that M23 rebels, backed by Rwanda's military, were responsible for the deaths of 13 South African soldiers in the DRC. Well, Kagame has hit back, accusing South Africa of distorting facts and acting as a direct participant in the conflict rather than a neutral peacekeeper. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, Washington has announced a sharp reduction in funding for African initiatives, including security, development, and humanitarian aid. And this move raises serious questions about America's long-term commitment to the continent, especially in an era where global powers like China and Russia are expanding their influence. And to help us unpack these critical issues, we're joined by Professor John Stremlau from the Department of International Relations and School of Social Sciences out in Wits, and he's joining us via a virtual platform. Professor, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Salam Media. Really appreciate you giving us your time this morning.
Well, thank you. On Kagame and the dust up with South Africa, it's important to remember that South Africa is a democracy and it's accountable to its people. America is a democracy and it's accountable to its people. Kagame is accountable to no one other than Kagame because he's a dictator. And there's similarly the Russian and Chinese. It's perplexing, I know, for Salam Radio and any other media to try to compare apples and oranges, but the idea that we are all nation states is a step forward that followed World War II, and sovereign equality and territorial integrity became the bedrock of the United Nations. But you've got to peel away the different kinds of regimes, and I was prepared to talk about Trump, and I'm glad to do it. But and I'll take your questions. But don't forget, this is an internal matter for Americans to resolve for themselves.
And speaking on Trump, I want to touch on exactly that as you know, the point of departure for our conversation. His administration has announced significant cuts to funding for African security and development programs, U.S. aid program being one that is very, very key on the continent. What does this signal about America's long-term commitment to Africa? Are we seeing a shift to a more inward-looking U.S. of A? And if that's the case, how will that ultimately, affect the geopolitical, world as we move forward in this new administration, in this second coming of Trump?
I don't mean to complicate your analysis, but it is important to keep in mind that Donald Trump represents the MAGA crowd, the Make America Great Again crowd, which has never defined itself very well. But I know that they're racist and they're ethnic nationalists and white nationalists. But they represent a very small core of the American body politic. Now, a recent Gallup poll showed that 28% of American voters vote Republican, 28% vote for Democrats, and that's what you all debate. But that polarization. But it's the 43% that are independents, and in a very close election, which, contrary to Trump's hyperbole, this was. It can go either way. It went for Biden in 2020. It went for Trump in 2024. But it's huge ramifications. But it's still for foreign policy, because obviously Trump represents a very different foreign policy than Biden. but the bureaucracy continues, and I hope that he is unsuccessful, and it's going to be court challenges to this. His dismissal of so many professional civil servants, but and there will be court challenges. But they've already walked back the saber rattling that they were doing on HIV/AIDS and the funding for that, because it would create a catastrophe for people who are relying on antiretrovirals. You can say that the PEPFAR has got to evolve and it's got to change, but okay, let's be deliberative about that. And Trump is not a deliberative guy. He doesn't read and he doesn't think and beyond what benefits him. So I wrote a piece for the Daily Maverick, which you can certainly see online, the Daily Maverick today, that said that South Africans would do well to question Trump's executive actions and whether they'll have a lasting impact on American democracy and its role in the world. And we don't know right now, and it's a shame that we're having to talk about this, because there would, you're a humanitarian organization with enormous concerns of in the Middle East, and you should be focusing on those. But here we are talking about Donald Trump.
And I guess it's the current state of affairs and where we find ourselves. I would like to bring this discussion a bit closer to home. Here in Africa, particularly with South Africa and the tensions with Rwanda out in the DRC. All of this combined with US, I'm not sure if I can call it disengagement, could lead to a greater instability on the continent. What do you make of the current state of affairs here in Africa and looking at this conflict out in the in the DRC?
Well, I go back a long way in my exposure to the DRC, and 30 or 40 years, and I'm not an expert on the DRC, and nor am I an expert on Rwanda, although the genocide would have been prevented perhaps if the Bill Clinton had a little bit more resolve in the U.S. and would support a humanitarian intervention to separate the two sides, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. But that's history, and now you've got a confrontation that is going to have to be resolved by Africans. And one of the way I got involved when I was at the Carter Center in the DRC was because I knew that Thabo Mbeki saw that the DRC was the heart of the matter, and in continental politics and the potential for development, and so he wanted to stabilize the DRC. Well, it's not very stable right now, and the Rwandans are involved in Goma, and apparently they've taken over. But you know this from the stories, and I'm reading the same news feeds that you are. So I don't know where it's going to go, but I don't think that the Trump administration, other than the professionals who are on the ground and in the embassies, but they're going to look to Washington, and they're not going to get any guidance, because Trump doesn't care about Africa, and he's preoccupied with the I don't know what, the wall between Mexico and the U.S. So he's not going to involve himself in this conflict. And I reflect on the first term of the Trump administration. I wrote a lot about the African concerns of the Trump administration, which were pretty close to zero, and yet the professionals managed to continue the programs, and maybe this will continue in a Trump too, but I don't know. It's too early to tell. But I can say that your focus on what Cyril Ramaphosa does is the right one, because it is the relatively powerful state in the mix in here, and it had troops on the ground. and they were killed. And so
mm,
Cyril Ramaphosa has a domestic problem explaining why these troops were killed. And I look with interest to see whether or not he's able to manage these things.
And I want to touch a bit more on that. South Africa's role in the issue out in the DRC, as you mentioned, goes a few decades, I think 2 decades or more, that there's been active involvement, whether diplomatic or with boots on the ground out in the DRC. Do you think this quote unquote peacekeeping mission to the DRC, in contrast to what you've mentioned earlier, where Thabo Mbeki was a bit more concerned on, the diplomatic role that South Africa could play when it comes to, making sure that there's peace in the Great Lakes region. The contrast between the two roles, the one that we currently have and the one that we previously had under Thabo Mbeki's administration, which one do you think works a bit more for South Africa to make sure that the influence and the objectives that have been laid out, to make sure that there's peace out in the DRC are eventually met? Which one of the two roles would be more effective?
It's a false choice. The historical circumstances were such that when and I knew a little bit about this because I was great admirer of Thabo Mbeki's foreign policy and how he was signaling that the DRC was really important, and he invested a lot of resources in trying to get the DRC stable and through elections, and I went out and monitored the 2006 or in the subsequent years process that was entailed by this decision. He committed an enormous amount of resources, but the situation is still a terrible mess. And I would not second guess DIRCO or the Department of International Cooperation Relations and Cooperation for figuring out what their policy options are today. It's a very different circumstance, and I think you do a disservice to your listeners, frankly, to posit it as an either or. You cannot. History is one damn thing after another, and what you try to do intelligently is to, and I would track Cyril Ramaphosa's actions very carefully and closely, but in the current situation, he's got to develop options in this situation. It's very different from what it was in the middle aughts, 2006, 2010. But it's dangerous and it's important, and so it's a story worth covering. But don't compare the Mbeki period to the Cyril Ramaphosa period.
And what do you make of Paul Kagame and his utterances, essentially saying that South Africa is ill-equipped to mediate in the DRC conflict? What do you make of that?
I don't know what to make of it. He's a dictator, and he has impressed a lot of people by his efficiencies as a dictator. But so is China, dictatorship, and if you live in a democracy with a free press, it's a messy business. But I think democracies are more resilient, and I think that South Africa will have its constitution a lot longer than Paul Kagame is going to be alive.
And we're going to leave it there, Prof. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us your time. Really, really appreciate your insights.
Okay.
There you have it there. Yeah, really, really interesting conversation there. Yeah, you can get in touch with us. You can let us know what do you think of Paul Kagame's utterances, essentially saying, well, South Africa, you're not who you think you are in the continent anymore. You're not equipped in any way to mediate the conflict out in the DRC. And he's also, well, sending somewhat chilling and shocking, warning to South Africa. He's saying his forces are ready to engage if it needs be. They are ready to take on the South African National Defense Force. And it will be quite interesting to see how Cyril Ramaphosa responds to this. Do you go about it diplomatically, or do you want to flex your muscle? Okay. Does South Africa still want to be seen as a leader on the continent? Do you still want to be seen as a powerhouse on the continent? And does utterances like that of Paul Kagame kind of undermine that fact? Ever. South Africa's 30-year democracy, I don't think there's ever been any African country, at least, that has came out so confident and so non-diplomatic and so confrontational to our government. Many feel like this is a direct attack on Pretoria and South Africa. But yeah, I think time will only tell how we respond to this one. But we certainly hope that, the response will be done with as little bloodshed as possible. South Africa prides itself as being a diplomatic country. We believe sitting on a round table and discussing our differences is of importance. And there's no other way of doing it except that. But, when you have the likes of Paul Kagame, saying we're ready, bring whatever you have, then how do you respond to that? Because we know how diplomacy works, particularly on the continent. Flexing your muscle, showing your military prowess is one of the ways that, one country, shows that it's head and shoulders above everyone else. And for the longest time, South Africa has prided itself on being the leader on the continent. But it seems like that's not the case anymore. It's been another incredible edition of News and Views with myself, Salalo Makwediri. Really appreciate you joining us. I'll be with you again next week for the Wednesday edition of the show. But for now, from myself, Salalo, and the rest of the team, it's Sharp Sharp.